Movies like The God Who Wasn't There in Zeitgeist, movies which have popularized the notion that Christianity is simply a retelling of prior mythologies. In essence, these movies argue that a group of conspirators assembled the fictional story of Jesus from several pre-existing mythologies and perpetuated an elaborate lie until they did. Successful large conspiracies are rare. The notion of a Christian conspiracy is simply unreasonable. Given what I know about the difficult nature of successful conspiracies, I can help the skeptics in my world as they assess the claims of the apostles. Successful conspiracies share a number of common characteristics. 1, a small number of conspirators. The smaller the number, the more likely the conspiracy will be successful. 2, thorough and immediate communication. This is key. When conspirators are unable to determine if their partners in crime have already given up the truth, they are far more likely to say something in an effort to save themselves from punishment. 3, a short time span. Lies are hard enough to tell once. They're even more difficult to repeat consistently over a long period of time, and for this reason, the shorter the conspiracy, the better. 4, significant relational connections. When all the co-conspirators are connected relationally in deep and meaningful ways, it is much harder to convince one of them to give up the other. 5, little or no pressure. Few suspects will confess to the truth until they recognize the jeopardy of failing to do so. Unless pressured to confess, conspirators will continue lying. The Christian conspiracy. When I was an atheist, I recognized that the most significant claim of the alleged apostolic eyewitnesses was their claim related to the resurrection. As I learned about the nature of conspiracies and had the opportunity to investigate and break several conspiracy cases, I started to doubt the reasonable nature of the alleged Christian conspiracy. Let's limit our discussion to the 12 apostles, adding Matthias as Judas's replacement. This number is prohibitively large from a conspiratorial perspective because none of the other characteristics of successful conspiracies existed for the 12 apostles, i.e. the apostles had little or no effective way to communicate with one another in a quick or thorough manner. Following their dispersion from Jerusalem, the 12 disciples were scattered across the Roman Empire, and according to the most ancient accounts, were ultimately interrogated and martyred far from one another. Methods of communication in the first century were painfully slow, from Peter in Rome to James in Jerusalem, Thomas in Melpower. The apostles appear to have been ultimately interrogated in locations that prevented them from communicating with one another in a timely manner. They had no idea if any of their co-conspirators had already given up the lie and saved themselves by simply confessing that Jesus was never resurrected. The apostles would have been required to protect their conspiratorial lies for an incredibly long time. The apostle John appears to have lived the longest, surviving nearly 60 years after the resurrection. And to make matters worse, many of them were strangers to one another prior to their time as disciples of Jesus. Some were brothers, but many were added over the course of Jesus' early ministry and came from diverse, disparate backgrounds, communities, families. Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Simon the Canaanite, Matthias, they had no family relationship to any of the other apostles. Successful conspiracies are unpressured conspiracies. The apostles, on the other hand, were aggressively persecuted as they were scattered from Italy to India, according to the records and accounts of the local communities. Each of these men suffered unimaginable physical distress and died a martyr's death. Ancient writers recorded that Peter was crucified upside down in Rome, James was killed with a sword in Jerusalem, and Thomas was murdered by a mob in Malaport. Martyrdom is not always proof. History is filled with examples of men and women who are committed to their religious views and were willing to die a martyr's death for what they believe. The hijackers who flew the planes into the Twin Towers, for example, well, they could be considered religious martyrs. Does their martyrdom testify to the truth of their beliefs? No. There's an important distinction that needs to be made here. You and I may die for what we believe today, trusting the testimony of those who were witnesses thousands of years ago. We were not there to see Jesus for ourselves, but we may believe that we have good reason to accept their testimony. Our martyrdom would therefore be a demonstration of this trust rather than a confirmation of truth. However, the original eyewitnesses were in a different position. They knew firsthand if their claims were true or not true. They didn't trust someone else for their testimony. They were making a first-hand assertion. The martyrdom of these original eyewitnesses is in a completely different category from the martyrdom of those who might follow them. If their claims were a lie, they would know it personally, unlike those who were martyred in the centuries that followed. Excerpts taken from Chapter 7 of Cold Case Christianity by Homicide Detective and Ex-Atheist J. Warner Wallace. For my commentary, I'd like to note that anti-Christian skeptics will respond to arguments like this with false equivalencies, more often than not, rather than addressing the substance of what's being said. They may say, well, what then about the initial believers in Islam? Which is something one could only say if they had not read nor studied the history of the Quran. The Quran is a testimony of one man, as he claimed to have heard it from a spiritual realm. He makes countless claims which contradict what dozens of Jews had written thousands of years prior to 700 years prior. There is simply no comparison. The Bible is a testimony of over 40 different individuals. These testimonies correspond well. Most claimed contradictions are easily defensible if one examines context and existing biblical scholarship. Another response may be, well, we only have testimony regarding these martyrs within the New Testament. False. One, it's reflective of illogical and anti-Christian bias to say we can't accept any evidence by those who believe in a specific claim, because then any evidence that comes up in favor of Christianity can be dismissed out of hand. If one were to deny all who believed that Plato existed and denied the authenticity of his authorship, one could just as easily dismiss the existence of Plato. In fact, even more easily than as the transcripts which we have from Plato come to us much later from original authorship than the testimonies we have from numerous writers of the books and letters expressed and represented in the New Testament. Two, again, it's simply false. It's false to say that the records we have of early Christian martyrs exist only within the pages of the New Testament. From the most trusted first century Jewish historian Josephus, we have records of it. It's ahistorical, as in it does not agree with the vast majority of scholarly historians to deny Josephus' testimony out of hand, and in doing so, it's likely an anti-Semitic bias. We have Josephus, we have Roman historian Tacitus, we have Clement, a bishop in Rome in the first century. We have many other historians and first century authors confirming the martyrdoms of the apostles and other Christians in the first century. So why then did they die? Why did those who claim to be eyewitnesses of Christ's resurrection die rather than recant, especially when separated and pressured in their own unique? I'll tell you why. They knew they'd be resurrected because they witnessed Christ's resurrection. Christ's resurrection, which was foretold by Yeshua himself. On this, they knew that regardless of the suffering presented to them in this realm, they would prosper in the next one. That concludes episode 1. Future episodes will include even smaller excerpts from Cold Case Christianity, but this point was essential to drive home, as conspiracy-based movies have made conspiracy theorists of many anti-Christian people who claim to be skeptics. If one is not skeptical of those who are affirming their beliefs, they are not a true skeptic. Christ is king and every knee will bow. Absolutely.